High in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers can't reach and winter storms claim lives, Jake Morrison stared at the rotting remains of his grandfather's cabin. The tech mogul had lost everything in a corporate scandal, his marriage hanging by threads thinner than mountain air. Sarah, his architect wife, saw only decay and mouse droppings, but Jake saw redemption. The October wind cut through his jacket as he kicked at a fallen beam. 6 months ago, he'd been worth $300 million. Now federal prosecutors were circling like vultures, and his company's stock had cratered after the whistleblower leaked those emails. Jake's hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of watching everything he'd built crumble. "This was a mistake," Sarah said, her breath forming clouds in the thin air. She'd barely spoken to him during the 5-hour drive from Denver. "We should have stayed and fought the charges. Running up here makes you look guilty." "I am guilty." The words came out quieter than he'd intended. "Maybe not of securities fraud, but of forgetting who I was. Grandpa Eli brought me here every summer until I was 16. This place, it meant something." Sarah's expression softened slightly as she surveyed the collapsed roof and buckled walls. Even in ruins, the cabin held traces of craftsmanship, hand-hewn logs, mortise and tenon joints that had held for decades before neglect finally won. As an architect, she could appreciate the bones of good construction. "The foundation looks solid," she admitted, stepping carefully through the debris. "But Jake, we're talking about a complete rebuild, in the middle of nowhere. With what money?" "I liquidated my Apple stock last week. We have enough." He watched her run her hands along a surviving beam, already analyzing sightlines and structural possibilities. Despite their fractured marriage, he knew that look. Sarah's mind was working. A gust of wind scattered dried leaves around their feet, and Jake noticed something odd. A section of floorboard near the old fireplace sat slightly higher than the rest. He'd played in this cabin as a boy, memorized every creak and corner, but this seemed different. He knelt and pressed down on the board. It shifted. "Sarah, look at this." She joined him as he pried up the loose planks with a broken piece of lumber. Underneath, wrapped in oiled canvas, lay a thick roll of papers. Jake's hands shook as he carefully unrolled the bundle. The papers were covered in precise technical drawings, blueprints unlike anything he'd ever seen. Mathematical formulas filled the margins in his grandfather's familiar handwriting, but these weren't normal calculations. They showed energy flows, harmonic resonance patterns, and structural designs that seemed to incorporate the natural magnetic field of the mountain itself. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered, studying the plans. "Look at these load calculations. And these angles, they're based on some kind of geological survey data, but it's measuring things we don't even have instruments for." The central design showed a building that rose from the cabin's foundation in a spiral pattern, each level positioned to catch and amplify what the notes called terrestrial emanations. Crystalline structures were integrated into the walls, and the roof design included chambers that would focus mountain winds through specific channels. "My grandfather was a simple rancher," Jake said, but even as he spoke, memories surfaced. Eli's unusual library filled with books on Tesla, Keeley, and other inventors history had forgotten. The way electronics sometimes malfunctioned around the old man, how wildlife seemed drawn to the cabin grounds, creating an ecosystem that thrived even in harsh winters. Sarah was frantically photographing the blueprints with her phone before the wind could scatter them. "Jake, if even half of what's shown here is possible, this isn't just a cabin restoration. This is a complete reimagining of how buildings interact with their environment. You think we could actually build this?" She looked up at him for the first time in weeks without anger in her eyes. "I think we have to try. Whatever your grandfather discovered, he hid it for a reason. Maybe he was waiting for the right time, the right people." As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Jake felt something shift inside his chest. The federal investigation, the media circus, the board meetings where former friends had looked through him like he was already gone. None of it seemed to matter up here. 120 days, he said suddenly. We'll give ourselves until spring to build whatever this is. Sarah nodded, rolling the blueprints carefully. We'll need supplies, tools, probably some specialized contractors for the more complex work. The nearest town is Pine Ridge, about 10 miles down the mountain. We can source most things there. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line, or saw how quickly that person disappeared when they began gathering their things to head back to town for the night. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows as Sarah pulled her rental car up the winding gravel road, her hybrid engine struggling against the steep mountain grade. Jake's Tesla had made the journey the day before, though she suspected his all-wheel drive model had handled the terrain better than her economy choice. Through the windshield, she caught her first glimpse of the cabin that would be their home for the next 3 months. It wasn't what she'd expected. Jake emerged from behind a stack of weathered lumber, work gloves already dirty, his usually pristine appearance replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and there was something different in his expression, a likeness she hadn't seen since the early days of their company. "Welcome to paradise," he called out, gesturing toward the structure that seemed to lean slightly to one side. Sarah stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp mountain air. Pine needles crunched under her feet as she approached what had once been a front porch. The cabin's logs were weathered silver gray, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that bore the scars of decades of harsh winters. "Your grandfather built this?" she asked, running her hand along a massive beam that still felt solid despite its age. "With his own hands, according to my dad. Grandpa Thomas was apparently quite the craftsman." Jake's voice carried a note of pride mixed with uncertainty. "I found some of his tools in the shed out back. They're old but well maintained." Sarah climbed the creaking steps and peered through the open door. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that revealed a surprisingly spacious interior. The main room featured a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to heat the entire space. Hand-hewn beams crossed the ceiling, and despite years of neglect, the bones of the structure seemed remarkably sound. "It has good bones," she murmured, echoing her grandmother's phrase for houses with potential. "That's what I was thinking. The foundation is solid granite, and most of the structural elements just need cleaning and minor repairs." Jake appeared beside her, his enthusiasm evident. "I've been here since dawn, and I keep finding little details that show how much care went into building this place." They spent the morning exploring together, cataloging what needed immediate attention versus what could wait. The roof required patching in several spots, the kitchen needed complete modernization, and the electrical system appeared to date from sometime around the Eisenhower administration. But underneath the neglect, Sarah could see the craftsmanship Jake had mentioned. Mortise and tenon joints that had held firm for 70 years, hand-carved details that spoke of patience and pride. "The previous owners left quite a collection," Jake said, leading her to what had once been a bedroom. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents mysterious under layers of dust. Sarah opened the nearest box and found herself looking at old photographs, black and white images of the cabin in its prime, surrounded by a garden that had long since returned to wilderness. A man she assumed was Jake's grandfather stood proudly beside a workshop that no longer existed, his sleeves rolled up and his expression satisfied. "He looks like you," she observed, holding up the photograph. Jake leaned closer to examine the image, his shoulder brushing hers. "Dad always said I inherited the family stubborn streak. Apparently, Grandpa Thomas once spent an entire winter hand-carving the banister for the main staircase because he didn't like the one he'd ordered from town. Where is this staircase now?" "That's the mystery. The cabin only has one floor, but there are definitely photos of an upstairs area." Jake pulled out another photograph showing an interior view with a curved wooden staircase leading to what appeared to be a loft space. Either it was removed at some point, or there's more to this place than meets the eye, Sarah finished, studying the photograph more carefully. The angle suggested the stairs had been located near the current kitchen area, but that wall showed no signs of modification. They continued searching through the boxes as the afternoon wore on, uncovering a treasure trove of family history. There were letters from Jake's grandfather to his grandmother during his service in World War II, detailed sketches of furniture he planned to build, and what appeared to be engineering drawings for various mechanical devices Sarah couldn't identify. "Jake, look at this." Sarah had moved to a box in the corner, one that had been sealed with tape that cracked as she pulled it away. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, were rolled blueprints. The paper was heavy and high quality, the kind used for serious architectural or engineering work. Jake carefully unrolled the first sheet on the dusty floor, weighing down the corners with stones from the fireplace. The drawing showed detailed schematics for what appeared to be some kind of mechanical device far more complex than anything they'd expected to find. Technical specifications covered the margins in precise handwriting, accompanied by calculations that suggested a level of engineering sophistication that seemed impossible for a simple mountain craftsman. "What do you think it is?" Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure why she felt the need to lower her voice. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows as Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door of his grandfather's workshop. Sarah followed close behind, her tablet already in hand, to document whatever they might find. The air inside was thick with decades of accumulated dust and the lingering scent of old wood and machine oil. "Look at this place," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with reverence. The workshop was enormous, far larger than it had appeared from outside. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces scarred from years of use. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboards, each one meticulously maintained despite the layer of dust. A massive lathe dominated one corner, its brass fittings green with patina. Jake ran his fingers along the edge of the nearest workbench, feeling the smooth indentations where countless projects had taken shape. "I had no idea Grandpa was this serious about woodworking. Dad never mentioned any of this." "Your grandfather was full of surprises, it seems." Sarah moved deeper into the workshop, her business instincts kicking in as she mentally catalogued the space. This setup would have cost a fortune. Even back then, these aren't hobbyist tools. Something glinted in the far corner, catching Jake's attention. He made his way over to discover an old filing cabinet, its top drawer slightly ajar. Inside, manila folders were arranged with military precision, each labeled in his grandfather's careful handwriting: irrigation systems, soil composition, weather patterns, and dozens more. "Sarah, you need to see this." Jake's voice carried a note of excitement as he pulled out folder after folder. "These aren't just random projects. Look at the dates. He was documenting everything about this mountain for 40 years. Sarah abandoned her exploration of the tool collection and hurried over. As she opened the first folder, her eyes widened. The documents inside weren't simple observations, but detailed scientific studies. Soil pH measurements taken monthly for decades, rainfall data correlated with crop yields from farms throughout the valley, temperature fluctuations mapped against wildlife migration patterns. "Jake, this is extraordinary research. Your grandfather was conducting environmental studies that would make university researchers jealous." She flipped through page after page of meticulous data. But why? What was he building up to? The answer came when Jake opened the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was embossed with a simple tree symbol, and the pages within were filled with his grandfather's handwriting and detailed sketches. Jake opened to a random page and began reading aloud. "The mountain provides everything needed for true sustainability, but only if we understand her rhythms. The old ways of farming fight against nature. What if we worked with her instead?" The sketches that accompanied the text were breathtaking in their complexity. Detailed diagrams showed water collection and distribution systems that seemed to mimic natural stream patterns, garden layouts that followed the mountain's natural contours, and throughout it all, calculations, precise mathematical formulas that transformed simple observations into actionable engineering plans. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching as she realized what they were looking at. These aren't just ideas. They're blueprints for a complete sustainable ecosystem. Look at this water management system. It would eliminate the drought problems the valley has been facing. They spent the next hour poring over the journal, discovering page after page of innovations. Solar collection systems designed to work in mountainous terrain. Root cellar designs that maintained perfect temperature year-round using the mountain's natural thermal properties. Greenhouse plans that extended growing seasons by months. "Here's something interesting," Jake said, pointing to a section titled Community Integration. His grandfather had outlined plans for sharing resources among multiple properties, creating a network of sustainable homesteads that supported each other. He wasn't just thinking about this cabin, he was envisioning transforming the entire mountain community. Sarah's mind was already racing with possibilities. In her years running tech companies, she'd seen countless business plans and innovation proposals. But this was different. This combined cutting-edge environmental science with old-fashioned mountain wisdom in ways that felt both revolutionary and completely natural. "Jake, do you realize what this represents? Your grandfather was 50 years ahead of his time. These solutions could address every environmental challenge this region faces." As if drawn by some invisible force, they both looked toward the back of the workshop where a large sheet covered something against the far wall. Jake walked over and pulled away the canvas, revealing a partially constructed prototype. It was clearly unfinished, but even in its incomplete state, the elegance of the design was obvious. "A water purification and distribution hub," Sarah said softly, recognizing the concept from the journal's sketches. He was actually building these systems. Jake felt something shift inside him as he stared at his grandfather's unfinished work. This wasn't just about restoring a cabin anymore. They'd stumbled onto something that could change everything, not just for them, but for everyone who called this mountain home. The question was whether they were ready to take on something this big. The morning sun filtered through dust motes dancing in the cabin's main room as Sarah spread the mysterious blueprints across the old dining table. Jake brought over 2 steaming mugs of coffee, the rich aroma mixing with the scent of aged wood and mountain air. "Look at this detail work," Sarah murmured, tracing her finger along the intricate mechanical drawings. "These aren't just sketches, they're professional engineering schematics. Your grandfather was more than just a craftsman." Jake leaned over her shoulder, close enough that she caught the clean scent of his soap. Despite everything between them, the proximity still made her pulse quicken. "I never knew he had this kind of technical knowledge. Dad always said Grandpa was just a simple mountain man who fixed watches. Simple mountain men don't design gear systems this sophisticated." Sarah pointed to a complex arrangement of wheels and pulleys. "This is graduate-level mechanical engineering. And look here." She flipped to another page. "These calculations are in multiple handwritings." He wasn't working alone. The blueprint before them showed what appeared to be some kind of water-powered generator, but unlike anything either had seen before. The design incorporated a series of cascading wheels that seemed to amplify rather than simply transfer energy. Notations in the margins referenced flow rates, torque calculations, and efficiency ratios that shouldn't have been possible with 1950 seconds technology. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. He pulled out a leather journal they'd found tucked behind the blueprints. "Listen to this. Day 47 of trials. The prototype exceeded our expectations again today. Martin thinks we're close to something that could change everything. But the company men came around asking questions. We may need to hide the work until the political climate improves." Sarah looked up from the blueprints. "Company men? What company?" "I don't know, but there are more entries." Sarah would have understood this better than any of us. Her mind for innovation always surpassed our own. If only she could see what her ideas have become. Jake's voice caught slightly. "There's that name again." A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain morning. That's my name. I noticed. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment the tension between them shifted from their past hurt to something else entirely, a shared mystery that seemed to be pulling them into something larger than themselves. Sarah turned back to the journal, her hands trembling slightly as she read over Jake's shoulder. Look at the date on that entry, 1953. And here's another one. Sarah's daughter would be about 10 now. Wonder if she'll inherit her mother's gift for seeing solutions where others see only problems. My grandmother's name was Eleanor, Jake said slowly. I would have remembered if there was a Sarah in the family. Maybe she wasn't family. Maybe she was a colleague, or... Sarah's voice trailed off as she noticed something else. At the bottom of one of the blueprint pages, in faded ink, was a signature, Sam Morrison, lead engineer. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the old mantel clock. Morrison, Sarah whispered. That's my maiden name. Jake stared at her. Your maiden name? My grandmother's maiden name was Morrison. But that's impossible. She lived in Chicago her whole life. She was a secretary for a steel company. But even as Sarah said it, she realized how little she actually knew about her grandmother's early life. Family stories had always been vague, full of gaps that no one seemed willing to fill. Jake flipped through more pages of the journal. Here, she designed the core mechanism. Without her mathematical insights, none of this would function. She sees patterns the rest of us miss. He looked up. Sarah, what if this isn't a coincidence? Before she could respond, the sound of a truck engine echoed from outside. They both froze, suddenly aware of how isolated they were, how little anyone knew about what they'd found. You expecting anyone? Sarah asked. Jake shook his head, moving to the window. It's probably just someone from town checking on the place. Word travels fast in small communities, but as he peered through the curtains, his expression changed. That's not a local truck. It's some kind of official vehicle. Sarah quickly began gathering the blueprints. We should put these back where we found them. Why? We're not doing anything wrong. Aren't we? She looked at him seriously. Your grandfather hid these for a reason. He was worried about company men asking questions. What if whoever that is out there is asking the same questions? The truck doors slammed shut outside, followed by the heavy footsteps of multiple people approaching the cabin. Jake and Sarah looked at each other, the blueprints clutched in her hands, both suddenly understanding that their quiet mountain retreat had just become something much more complicated. The footsteps reached the porch, and someone knocked firmly on the door. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Jake traced his finger along the intricate lines of the blueprint they'd discovered. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, her laptop balanced on her knees as she tried to make sense of the technical specifications scattered across the aged paper. This doesn't make any sense, she murmured, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Look at these measurements. Your grandfather was designing some kind of water filtration system, but the scale is enormous. This isn't for a single household. Jake leaned closer, breathing in the faint scent of her shampoo, mixed with the cabin's mustiness. The creek runs right behind the property. Maybe he was thinking bigger than just the cabin. He pointed to a series of calculations in the margin, written in his grandfather's precise handwriting. These flow rates, they're calculating for an entire watershed. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard as she pulled up satellite images of the surrounding area. Jake, look at this. Her voice carried an excitement that made him lean over her shoulder. The creek system feeds into the main water supply for 3 different towns down the mountain: Millbrook, Cedar Falls, and Riverside. That's over 15,000 people, Jake said quietly, the implications beginning to dawn on him. He'd spent the last 5 years building technology companies, but this felt different. This felt personal. They worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, Sarah's engineering background complementing Jake's business instincts as they began to piece together his grandfather's vision. The blueprint wasn't just for a filtration system. It was for a revolutionary water purification network that could transform the entire region's access to clean water. A knock at the cabin door interrupted their concentration. Jake opened it to find a weathered man in his 60s standing on the porch, wearing work boots and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. "You must be Henry's grandson," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Tom Mitchell. I live about a mile down the road. Heard you were up here fixing the place up." "Jake Morrison. This is Sarah Chen." Jake shook the man's hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "Did you know my grandfather well?" Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "Known Henry for 40 years. We served together in Vietnam before he moved up here." He glanced past Jake into the cabin, his eyes falling on the papers spread across the floor. "Looks like you found his project." Sarah looked up sharply. "You knew about this?" "Henry talked about it for years. Always said this mountain had the potential to provide the cleanest water in the state, if someone just had the vision to do it right." Tom stepped inside, his boots creaking on the old floorboards. Problem was, he never had the resources to make it happen. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition, perhaps, of purpose he hadn't expected to find. What happened to the project? Why didn't he pursue it? Tom settled into one of the dusty chairs, his weathered hands folding in his lap. "Your grandfather was a dreamer, but he was also practical. This kind of undertaking needed serious capital, permits, environmental studies. He was just one man with a big idea." He paused, studying Jake's face. "But you're not just one man, are you? Word travels fast up here. We know who you are." Sarah closed her laptop, her attention fully focused on Tom now. "Is there still a need for something like this? The water situation in the valley, how bad is it?" Tom's laugh was bitter. "Bad enough that my neighbors are buying bottled water because they don't trust what comes out of their taps. Bad enough that the elementary school in Millbrook had to install expensive filtration systems last year. Bad enough that businesses are starting to look elsewhere." Jake walked to the window, looking out at the creek that bubbled past the cabin. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his memory. Stories of the mountain's pure springs, of water so clean you could drink it straight from the source. That was before development, before runoff, before decades of neglect had compromised the natural systems. "Tom," Jake said, turning back to face the older man, "would you be willing to help us understand what Henry was really trying to accomplish here?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and risk. Sarah watched Jake's profile, recognizing the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, in boardrooms when he was about to make a decision that would change everything, in their apartment when he'd first suggested leaving the city behind. Tom stood slowly, a smile creasing his weathered features. "Son, I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask me that question." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Henry always said this mountain would provide for the valley someday. Maybe it's finally time to find out if he was right." As Tom's footsteps faded down the mountain path, Jake and Sarah looked at each other, both understanding that their quiet retreat had just transformed into something much larger than themselves. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Sarah spread the blueprints across the newly cleared dining table. Jake emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, pausing to study her focused expression as she traced the intricate drawings with her finger. "I've been thinking about what your grandfather wrote," she said without looking up, "about the community needing something to bring them together. These plans, they're not just for a machine, Jake. They're for something much bigger." Jake set down her mug and leaned over her shoulder, catching the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the cabin's woody atmosphere. The blueprints seemed even more complex in the daylight, revealing details they'd missed the night before. What he'd initially thought were simple mechanical drawings now appeared to be interconnected systems, each component building upon the last. "Look at this section here." Sarah pointed to a series of curved lines and measurements. "These aren't just structural elements, they're acoustic chambers. And these calculations, they're for resonance frequencies." Jake felt his pulse quicken. During his MIT years, he'd studied acoustic engineering as an elective, fascinated by how sound could influence human behavior and emotion. "You think he was building some kind of audio system?" "More than that. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began photographing sections of the blueprints. I want to run these measurements through some modeling software back at the hotel, but if I'm reading this correctly, your grandfather was designing something that could create harmonic frequencies across a wide area. The implications sent a chill down Jake's spine. His grandfather had been a simple craftsman, or so the family had always believed. Where would he have learned advanced acoustic engineering? And why had he hidden these plans so carefully? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, they could see Tom standing on the porch, his weathered hands clutching a thermos and a paper bag. "Brought you folks some of Mabel's fresh biscuits," Tom said, as Jake opened the door. His eyes immediately went to the table where the blueprints lay exposed. His face changed, cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like relief. "You found them," Tom said quietly, stepping inside without invitation. "Henry's plans. I wondered if they'd survived all these years." Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. "You knew about these?" Jake asked. Tom set down his offerings and approached the table reverently. "Your grandfather showed them to me once, maybe 40 years ago. Course, I didn't understand half of what I was looking at then. Still don't, if I'm being honest." He touched the edge of one blueprint gently. "But Henry, he understood. Said these drawings came to him in dreams after your grandmother passed." "Dreams?" Sarah's scientific mind clearly bristled at the notion, but she kept her tone respectful. "I know how it sounds," Tom said with a slight smile. But Henry wasn't given to flights of fancy. He said Elizabeth came to him, showed him how to build something that would help the mountain heal. The community had been struggling even then. Young folks leaving for the cities, old traditions dying out, neighbors growing apart. Jake studied Tom's weathered face, searching for signs of delusion or embellishment. Instead, he saw the steady gaze of someone sharing a long-held truth. Did he ever try to build it? Started to. Gathered materials, even began construction behind the cabin. But then he got sick and... Tom trailed off, his eyes distant. "The night before he died, he made me promise something. Said one day someone from his family would come back, and they'd know what to do with Elizabeth's gift." The cabin fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the fireplace. Sarah's rational mind was clearly wrestling with the story, while Jake felt an odd sense of destiny settling over him like a familiar coat. "Where did he start building?" Sarah asked finally. Tom gestured toward the back of the cabin. "About 50 yards into the woods, cleared a space and laid a foundation. Nature's reclaimed most of it by now, but the stones are probably still there." Without discussion, all three of them moved toward the back door. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Tom led them along an overgrown path that Jake hadn't noticed during their previous explorations. "There," Tom said, pointing to what looked like random stones scattered among the underbrush. But as Jake's eyes adjusted, he began to see the pattern. The stones formed a perfect circle roughly 20 feet in diameter. Moss and small saplings had grown between them, but the geometric precision was unmistakable. Sarah was already pulling out her tablet, taking measurements and photographs. "Jake, the dimensions match the foundation specifications in the blueprints exactly." Standing in that hidden clearing, surrounded by his grandfather's carefully placed stones, Jake felt the weight of family legacy settling on his shoulders. Whatever Henry and Elizabeth had envisioned, whatever had driven them to create these elaborate plans, it was now his responsibility to understand and fulfill. The mountain seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his decision. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's newly repaired windows as Sarah spread the blueprints across the kitchen table for what felt like the 100th time. Each viewing revealed new details, subtle annotations in the margins that seemed to whisper secrets from decades past. Jake stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders as they both studied the intricate drawings. "Look at this section again," Sarah murmured, pointing to a complex array of gears and levers in the corner of the main schematic. "These measurements don't match anything I've seen in standard engineering texts. It's like your grandfather was working from an entirely different set of principles. Jake leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. The intimacy of their collaboration had grown stronger each day, built through shared discovery and late-night conversations by the fire. My father always said Grandpa was ahead of his time, but I never understood what he meant until now. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their concentration. Through the window, they could see Tom Martinez, the local hardware store owner, standing on the porch with a cardboard box in his arms. His weathered face carried an expression of barely contained excitement. "Come in, Tom," Jake called out, rolling up the blueprints instinctively. Even though they'd begun to trust the townspeople, something about the plans felt too precious, too dangerous to share carelessly. Tom stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the cabin's transformed interior. The past weeks of restoration had revealed beautiful hardwood floors and exposed beams that gave the space a warm, lived-in feeling. "Place looks incredible. Your grandfather would be proud." He set the box down on the counter with deliberate care. "Found something in my storage room that belongs to you." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances as Tom opened the box, revealing an assortment of brass fittings, specialized tools, and what appeared to be precision-crafted components wrapped in oiled cloth. "Henry ordered these parts back in 1967, Tom explained, unwrapping a particularly intricate piece that gleamed in the morning light. "Never came to pick them up. My father kept them all these years," said Henry was working on something important. "After he disappeared, Dad figured someday family would come looking." Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized the component's design. It matched perfectly with several elements from the blueprints. "This is incredible, Tom. How did your father know to keep these?" The older man's expression grew thoughtful. "Henry and my dad were close friends, served together in Korea. Dad always believed Henry didn't just vanish, said he was protecting something valuable." Tom paused, studying Jake's face. "You've got his eyes, you know, and that same stubborn determination when you're working on a problem." Jake carefully lifted one of the components, feeling its substantial weight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, clearly custom-made to exact specifications. "Did your father ever mention what kind of project Henry was working on?" "Only that it would change everything for folks up here in the mountains." Tom's voice carried a mixture of hope and skepticism. Of course, that was right before the mines started failing and people began leaving. Maybe if he'd finished whatever he was building. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Henry's disappearance, the mine's failure, and now these sophisticated plans for something that could transform an entire community. "Tom, do you remember anything else about that time? Any other details about what Henry might have been working on?" Tom rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there was one thing. Henry used to talk about water, not just any water, but the way it moved through the mountain. Spent a lot of time studying the old mining maps, tracking underground streams and natural channels." He gestured toward the window where the distant sound of rushing water could be heard. "Always said this mountain was full of untapped potential if someone was smart enough to unlock it." Jake felt his pulse quicken. Water power, mechanical engineering, community transformation. Pieces of a puzzle were beginning to align in his mind. "Would you be willing to show us those mining maps if they still exist?" "Already thought of that." Tom smiled, pulling a rolled document from the bottom of the box. "Dad made copies years ago. Figured they might be important someday." As Tom unrolled the maps, Sarah gasped. The underground water systems formed an intricate network throughout the mountain, with several major streams converging near the cabin's location. Combined with Henry's blueprints, the possibilities were staggering. "There's something else," Tom said quietly. "The town council's meeting tomorrow night. Word's getting around that you two are up to something interesting. People are curious, hopeful even. We haven't had much reason for hope in a long time." Jake looked at Sarah, seeing his own mixture of excitement and apprehension reflected in her eyes. They were no longer just restoring a cabin or solving a family mystery. They were potentially holding the key to an entire community's future, built on the dreams and plans of a man who had vanished 50 years ago. The weight of responsibility settled on their shoulders like a familiar coat. heavy but not unwelcome. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop floor as Sarah studied the latest iteration of their device. What had started as cryptic blueprints had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. The sleek metallic frame hummed with quiet energy, its crystalline core pulsing with a soft blue light that seemed almost alive. Jake emerged from beneath the workbench, wiping grease from his hands. The resonance frequency is stabilizing, but I still don't understand how it's generating this much output with such minimal input. He paused, watching the gentle oscillations of light within the device. It's like it's drawing energy from somewhere we can't measure. Sarah nodded, her fingers dancing across the tablet displaying their readings. The efficiency ratios are impossible according to conventional physics. We're seeing a 97% energy conversion rate. But conversion from what? She looked up at Jake, excitement and bewilderment warring in her expression. Your grandfather wasn't just an inventor, Jake. He was decades ahead of his time. The workshop door creaked open, and Tom Chen stepped inside, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Over the past weeks, the elderly man had become their unofficial liaison with the mountain community, helping them source materials and navigate the complex web of local relationships. "Thought you two might need some coffee," Tom said, setting down a thermos and 3 cups. His eyes immediately found the device, and Sarah noticed the slight catch in his breath. "My goodness, you actually built it." Jake straightened, studying Tom's reaction. "You've seen this before." Tom poured coffee with deliberate care, his silence stretching until Sarah wondered if he would answer at all. Finally, he set down the thermos and met Jake's gaze. "Not this exactly, but something similar. Your grandfather showed me drawings once, many years ago. He said it could change everything." "What exactly does it do?" Sarah asked, though she suspected Tom knew more than he was letting on. "That's not for me to say," Tom replied. "But I can tell you this. There are people in town who've been waiting a long time for someone to finish what Henry started." Jake frowned. "Waiting? What do you mean, waiting?" Before Tom could answer, the device's humming shifted to a higher frequency. Sarah spun toward it, watching as the blue light intensified and began to pulse in a rhythmic pattern. The air around the device shimmered, and suddenly the workshop's overhead bulbs blazed brighter, despite not being connected to any power source. "It's wireless energy transmission," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her. "But the range, the efficiency, this shouldn't be possible." Tom chuckled softly. "Henry always said the mountain had its own energy, its own secrets. Maybe he just figured out how to listen." Jake approached the device cautiously, noting how his tablet's battery indicator had jumped from 30% to full charge. The implications are staggering. If we can scale this up, create a network, we could power the entire mountain without traditional infrastructure, Sarah finished. No more struggling with power lines through rough terrain, no more grid dependency. Tom's expression grew serious. That's exactly what Henry hoped for. This community has been isolated for too long, held back by practical limitations. Young people leave because there's no reliable power for modern businesses. Families struggle because basic services are too expensive to maintain. Sarah felt a chill of realization. The blueprints weren't just random invention sketches. They were a complete system design. Jake pulled out his grandfather's journal, flipping to a page he'd marked earlier. "Listen to this. The mountain gives freely to those who understand its language. What I've discovered here could lift up every soul in this valley, but the world isn't ready. Perhaps someday someone will finish what I've started." The device's pulsing had settled into a steady rhythm, its energy field extending in a perfect sphere around their workshop. Sarah walked the perimeter, her instruments registering the field's edge with startling precision. "Jake," she called, excitement building in her voice. "The field radius is exactly 100 meters. That's not arbitrary, it's designed to be modular. If we built multiple units and positioned them strategically, we could create an overlapping network covering the entire mountainside," Jake said, his mind racing with possibilities. Tom smiled, but there was something melancholy in his expression. Henry would be proud. He dreamed of seeing the old mining families return, of young people building futures here instead of fleeing to the cities. Sarah looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully grasp. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us." Tom was quiet for a long moment, then walked to the window overlooking the valley. "Your grandfather didn't work alone, Jake. There were people who believed in his vision. Some of them are still here, still waiting." He turned back to them, his eyes serious. "But there were also those who tried to stop him, people who had reasons to keep this mountain isolated, forgotten." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of reasons?" "The kind that don't disappear just because time passes," Tom said quietly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop as Jake and Sarah stood before their completed creation. 3 weeks of intense labor had transformed the cryptic blueprints into something that defied easy categorization, part sculpture, part machine, part mystery. The device rose from the wooden floor like a metallic tree, its copper branches reaching toward the cabin's rafters, while crystalline nodes pulsed with a soft internal light. "Your grandfather was brilliant," Sarah whispered, running her fingers along the intricate engravings that spiraled up the central column. "But what exactly did we build?" Jake shook his head, equally mesmerized. The device hummed with an energy that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and into their bones. According to the blueprints, they needed only to activate the primary sequence, a series of touches to specific nodes in a pattern his grandfather had carefully documented. "Only one way to find out," Jake said, reaching for the first activation point. The moment his finger made contact, the entire structure came alive. Light cascaded through the crystalline network like liquid electricity, and a deep, harmonic tone filled the air. But something else happened, something the blueprints hadn't prepared them for. Images began forming in the light itself, holographic projections that painted the workshop in scenes from another time. They watched, transfixed, as ghostly figures moved through their space. Men and women in clothing from decades past, working on similar devices, taking measurements, recording observations, and there, clear as day, stood Jake's grandfather as a young man, directing the operation with passionate intensity. "This isn't possible," Sarah breathed, but her scientific skepticism warred with the evidence before her eyes. The projections shifted, showing the mountain community as it once was, thriving, prosperous, with similar devices positioned throughout the valley. Children played in streets lined with gardens that grew impossibly lush, while adults worked on projects that seemed to blend technology with nature in ways that shouldn't have been achievable with mid-20th century resources. Then the images darkened. They saw heated arguments, government vehicles arriving in the night, and the systematic dismantling of the devices. The final projection showed Jake's grandfather, older now and clearly defeated, carefully burying the blueprints beneath the cabin before boarding up the windows one last time. As the visions faded, Jake noticed something else. The very air around them felt different, cleaner, more alive. Through the workshop windows, he could see that the struggling saplings they'd planted weeks ago had suddenly doubled in size, their leaves a vibrant green that seemed to glow in the morning light. "The Soil Enhancement Project," Sarah realized, her voice filled with wonder. "But this is beyond anything we theorized. This isn't just improving the Earth, it's harmonizing the entire ecosystem." A knock at the cabin door interrupted their amazement. Jake reluctantly moved to answer it, finding Martha standing on the porch with an expression he'd never seen before, part fear, part hope, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "I felt it," she said simply. "The awakening. Your grandfather told me this day might come, but I never truly believed." Her eyes moved past him to the glow emanating from the workshop. "May I see it?" Jake stepped aside, and Martha entered with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. When she saw the activated device, tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. 60 years, she whispered. 60 years we've been waiting." She turned to Jake with an intensity that made him step back. Your grandfather wasn't just an inventor, child. He was part of something larger, a group of visionaries who discovered how to accelerate natural healing and growth through harmonic resonance. They called it the Earth Song Project. Why did it end? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Fear, Martha replied bitterly. Fear of change, fear of what they didn't understand. The government claimed it was unsafe, unregulated, but really they were terrified of technology they couldn't control or weaponize. So they shut it down, scattered the researchers, and tried to erase it from history. Jake felt the weight of legacy settling on his shoulders. The community, they know, don't they? That's why everyone's been so interested in our restoration work. Martha nodded. Some remember the old days, others have just heard stories. But we've all been waiting for someone with the knowledge and resources to rebuild what was lost. As if summoned by their conversation, more vehicles began arriving. Jake watched through the window as neighbors he'd barely met climbed out of trucks and cars, all moving toward the cabin with purposeful determination. He recognized the postmaster, the woman who ran the general store, and several others who'd been friendly but distant during their previous encounters. What happens now? He asked Martha. She smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was entirely without reservation. Now we rebuild, not just the devices but the community, the way it should have been all along. The device's harmonic tone seemed to grow stronger, as if responding to the gathering crowd outside. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop as Jake studied the latest modifications to their creation. What had started as following his grandfather's blueprints had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. The device hummed quietly on the workbench, its crystalline core pulsing with an ethereal blue light that seemed to respond to their presence. Sarah looked up from her laptop, where lines of code scrolled past in an endless cascade. The energy readings are still climbing. Whatever your grandfather discovered, it's not just about the mechanical components. There's something else at play here. Jake nodded, running his fingers along the intricate engravings that covered the device's surface. The symbols had become clearer over the past few days, revealing patterns that seemed familiar yet impossible. I keep thinking about what Mrs. Chen said at the general store yesterday, about the mountain having its own heartbeat. You think she knows something? Maybe. Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo he'd taken of one of the blueprint pages. Look at this symbol here. I swear I've seen it somewhere in town. Sarah leaned closer, squinting at the screen. It looks like the carving above the entrance to the old mining office, the building next to Murphy's Diner. Before Jake could respond, a knock echoed through the cabin. They exchanged glances. Visitors were rare this far up the mountain. Jake opened the door to find a woman in her 60s, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing hiking boots and a weathered jacket. You must be Thomas Whitmore's grandson, she said, extending her hand. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I worked with your grandfather many years ago. Jake's heart skipped. Worked with him? On what? May I come in? What I have to tell you is complicated. Sarah quickly minimized her laptop screen as Dr. Vasquez entered. The woman's eyes immediately found the device on the workbench, and her expression shifted to one of wonder mixed with concern. Dear God, you actually built it. She approached slowly, as if the device might disappear. Thomas always believed it was possible, but seeing it here— You know what this is? Sarah asked. Dr. Vasquez pulled out a worn leather journal from her jacket. Your grandfather and I were part of a research team in the 1970s. We were studying unusual electromagnetic phenomena in this mountain range. What we found defied conventional science. Jake felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. The symbols, the energy readings. This isn't just some invention, is it? Thomas believed this mountain sits on what he called a confluence point, a place where the Earth's natural energy fields intersect in extraordinary ways. Dr. Vasquez opened her journal, revealing pages of notes and diagrams that mirrored the blueprints they'd been following. Your device isn't generating energy so much as channeling and amplifying what's already here. Sarah's scientific skepticism warred with the evidence before her eyes. That's impossible. Energy doesn't work that way, doesn't it? Dr. Vasquez moved to the window, gazing out at the mountain peaks. We barely understand a fraction of what the Earth is capable of. Thomas spent decades refining those blueprints, trying to create something that could harmonize with the mountain's natural rhythms. The device's humming suddenly intensified, and the blue light pulsed brighter. Through the cabin windows, they could see lights beginning to flicker on in the valley below, even though it was still mid-morning. "It's affecting the town," Jake breathed. Dr. Vasquez nodded gravely. "The question is whether you're ready for what comes next." Thomas never completed his work because he feared the implications. What you've built could transform this entire region, bring prosperity, clean energy, possibilities we can barely imagine, but it could also attract attention from people who would exploit it. Jake thought about the struggling businesses in town, the young families moving away for better opportunities, the gradual decline he'd witnessed. What was my grandfather afraid of? That the wrong people would take control, that something meant to heal and nurture would become a tool for power and greed. She closed her journal. He hid the blueprints and disbanded our team, but he never stopped believing that someday the right person would find them and finish what we started. Sarah reached for Jake's hand. "The choice is ours." Through the window, more lights appeared in the valley, not electric lights, but something else. Gardens seemed greener, streams ran clearer, and there was an almost imperceptible shift in the air itself, as if the mountain was awakening from a long sleep. Dr. Vasquez moved toward the door. "I'll leave you to decide, but know this, your grandfather trusted that his legacy would find its way to someone who would use it wisely. Looking at what you've accomplished together, I believe he was right." After she left, Jake and Sarah stood in silence, watching their creation pulse with quiet energy. The weight of possibility and responsibility settled around them like the mountain mist, beautiful and daunting in equal measure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop as Jake stared at the completed device, its crystalline core pulsing with a soft blue light. 3 weeks had passed since they'd first activated it, and the changes in the community were becoming impossible to ignore. Mrs. Henderson's arthritis had vanished completely. The Morrison's dying apple orchard was now bursting with fruit out of season. Even the creek that had run dry for decades was flowing again, its water clearer than anyone remembered. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her expression troubled. Channel 7 is running another story about the Miracle Mountain. They're calling it everything from a hoax to divine intervention. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. "At least they haven't traced it back to us yet." "Haven't they?" Sarah pulled out her phone, showing him a social media post with their workshop visible in the background of someone's photo. "Tommy Carver posted this yesterday. Look at the comments." Jake scrolled through dozens of responses, his stomach tightening with each one. People were asking questions, making connections. Someone had even recognized him from tech magazines, wondering what the reclusive billionaire was doing in their small mountain town. "We need to shut it down," Sarah said quietly, "at least until we understand what we're dealing with." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley. 3 black SUVs wound their way up the mountain road, moving with the purposeful precision of a government convoy. "Too late," Jake muttered, watching the vehicles park near the cabin. Men and women in dark suits emerged, their movements coordinated and professional. The lead figure was a woman in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Chen," she called out as she approached. "I'm Agent Rebecca Torres with the Department of Advanced Research Projects. We need to talk." Jake's mind raced. DARPA's involvement meant this had escalated beyond anything he'd anticipated. "Not sure what you think." "Please." Agent Torres held up a hand. "We're not here to shut you down or confiscate your work. We're here because we've been monitoring unusual energy signatures in this region, and frankly, we're impressed. Sarah stepped closer to Jake, her journalist instincts on high alert. Monitoring how long? Since the first activation 3 weeks ago. Torres gestured toward the workshop. May we? Jake exchanged glances with Sarah, then nodded reluctantly. They led the group inside, where the device continued its gentle pulsing. Several agents immediately began taking readings with sophisticated equipment while Torres examined the device itself. Remarkable, she murmured. The energy output is unlike anything we've seen, but it's the application that truly fascinates us. Targeted environmental restoration, biological regeneration, it's responding to needs rather than simply radiating power. You seem to know a lot about it, Jake said carefully. Torres turned to face him, her expression serious. Mr. Chen, your grandfather worked with us during the war. Project Harmonic was classified at the highest levels, and when he disappeared with the research, we assumed it was lost forever. The workshop fell silent except for the device's gentle humming. Jake felt the world shift beneath his feet. My grandfather was a simple engineer. He built bridges and he built much more than that. Torres pulled out a tablet, showing him declassified documents. Dr. Chen Wei was our lead researcher on resonance field applications. His theoretical work on environmental harmony was decades ahead of its time. Sarah leaned over Jake's shoulder, reading quickly. It says here the project was terminated due to safety concerns. Dr. Chen believed the technology wasn't ready, Torres confirmed. He was worried about uncontrolled applications, potential weaponization. One day, he simply vanished along with all the core research. We found this cabin eventually, but by then it was empty. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he processed this revelation. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding from something, he'd been protecting something. What do you want from us? Partnership, Torres said simply. The applications for this technology are extraordinary. Climate restoration, medical advancement, sustainable energy, but it needs proper oversight and resources to reach its full potential. And if we refuse? Sarah asked. Torres smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Then you continue your work here, under observation, while we try to reverse engineer what you've accomplished. I'd prefer collaboration. Jake walked closer to the device, placing his hand on its smooth surface. The pulsing seemed to respond to his touch, growing slightly brighter. His grandfather's final letter had warned him about choices, about the responsibility that came with the knowledge, but perhaps hiding wasn't the answer. Perhaps it was time to trust. We'll need guarantees, he said finally, about how it's used, who controls it. That can be arranged. Jake looked at Sarah, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They'd sought escape and found purpose, discovered love and uncovered secrets. Now they stood at another crossroads, holding the future of his grandfather's legacy in their hands. The device pulsed brighter, as if responding to the weight of the decision before them. The morning light filtered through the pine trees as Jake carefully lifted the final component into place. His hands trembled slightly, not from the weight, but from the magnitude of what they were about to activate. Sarah stood beside him, her tablet displaying readings from sensors they'd positioned throughout the valley over the past week. Energy levels are stable, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the gentle hum emanating from their creation. Jake, are you sure we're ready for this? He looked down at the device that had consumed their lives for months. What had started as a simple restoration project had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. The blueprints, hidden in his grandfather's cabin, had been just the beginning, a key that unlocked not only a revolutionary technology, but a family legacy that stretched back generations. My grandfather built the prototype 70 years ago, Jake said, running his fingers along the polished metal surface. He never got to see it completed. I think he'd want us to finish what he started. Sarah nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. They'd tested smaller versions, seen the incredible results on a limited scale. But this would affect the entire community. The responsibility felt crushing. Tom Harrison emerged from the tree line, followed by a growing crowd of locals. Word had spread through Pine Ridge despite their attempts at secrecy. Mrs. Chen from the general store walked alongside the mayor, while the Kawano family brought their teenage daughter, who'd been documenting everything for her environmental science project. "Whatever you two have been working on up here," Tom called out, slightly out of breath from the climb. "The whole valley's been talking about it. Plants are growing faster, the creek's running cleaner than it has in decades. Even the wildlife seems different." Jake exchanged a glance with Sarah. They'd noticed the changes too, but hearing it confirmed by others made their achievement feel both more real and more daunting. "We've been following the energy signatures," Sarah explained, gesturing to her tablet. "The preliminary tests created a field effect that extends roughly 2 miles in every direction. What we're about to activate should expand that range significantly." Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne stepped forward from the crowd, her expression a mixture of scientific curiosity and genuine concern. "I've been monitoring the local ecosystem for the environmental impact study. In 3 weeks, I've documented changes that should take years to occur naturally. The soil composition, the water quality, even the cellular activity and plant life. It's all accelerated, but in a completely sustainable way." Jake felt the weight of his family's secret pressing down on him. His grandfather's journals, hidden behind the false wall in the cabin, had revealed the truth about their family's work. They weren't just inventors or entrepreneurs, they were guardians of a technology that could fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with the natural world. "There's something you all need to know," Jake began, his voice carrying across the clearing. "My grandfather didn't just design this technology. He was part of a group of scientists who recognized that our industrial progress was coming at too high a cost. They developed this as a way to reverse environmental damage while still allowing human advancement." Sarah picked up the thread of his explanation. "The device creates what we're calling a harmony field. It doesn't just clean the environment, it establishes a symbiotic relationship between human technology and natural systems. Everything within the field operates more efficiently, more sustainably." The crowd murmured among themselves, some faces showing excitement, while others reflected the skepticism of people who'd heard too many promises of technological salvation. Margaret Foster, the town librarian, stepped forward with an old newspaper clipping in her hands. "I've been researching since you started your project. Your grandfather disappeared in 1953, right around the time several prominent scientists vanished. There were rumors about a secret government project, something that got shut down during the Cold War." Jake nodded grimly. "They were forced to scatter, to hide their research. My grandfather chose this valley because it was remote enough to continue his work in secret. He spent the rest of his life refining the design, leaving everything for someone who would understand its importance." Sarah's tablet chimed softly. "The solar alignment is optimal," she announced. "If we're going to do this, it needs to be now." The crowd fell silent as Jake's hand hovered over the activation sequence. Once triggered, there would be no going back. The harmony field would transform not just the landscape, but the entire way their community existed within it. He thought about his grandfather, alone in this valley for decades, carrying the burden of knowledge that could change the world. He thought about Sarah, who'd left behind a successful career to help him unlock this family mystery. Most of all, he thought about the community gathered around them, trusting them with their future. "Together?" he asked Sarah, extending his hand toward the activation panel. She placed her hand over his, and together they initiated the sequence that would transform Pine Ridge forever. The morning sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows as Jake stared at the letter in his trembling hands. Sarah stood beside him, her face pale as she read over his shoulder. The aged paper crackled softly, releasing the faint scent of lavender and old ink. "My dearest grandson," the letter began in his grandmother's familiar script. "If you are reading this, then you have found your grandfather, greatest work, and I can finally share the truth I have carried for 60 years. Jake's breath caught as he continued reading. The words seemed to dance on the page, each revelation more stunning than the last. His grandfather hadn't just been an inventor, he'd been part of a secret government project during the Cold War, tasked with developing technology that could revolutionize communication and energy distribution. "The device you've built," the letter continued, "was never meant to be just a machine. It was designed to create networks of human connection, to break down the barriers that divide communities and nations. Your grandfather believed that true peace could only come through understanding, and understanding required genuine connection between people." Sarah's hand found Jake's shoulder as he read the most shocking revelation. His grandfather hadn't died in a simple accident, as the family had always believed. He had been forced to abandon his work when the project was deemed too dangerous by those who feared its potential to upset existing power structures. He had hidden the blueprints and disappeared into the mountains, living under the pretense of being a simple hermit while actually continuing his research in secret. "But there's more," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The letter explained how his grandfather had discovered that the technology could do more than connect minds. It could heal them. The strange energy patterns they had observed weren't just side effects. They were the device's primary function, designed to repair damaged neural pathways and restore emotional balance. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The changes in the town, the way people have been connecting, healing old wounds, it's all intentional. The device has been working exactly as your grandfather planned. Jake nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The mysterious improvements in elderly residents' cognitive function, the sudden resolution of long-standing feuds, the inexplicable sense of community that had blossomed since they'd activated the device. It all made sense now. The letter's final paragraphs contained coordinates and a cryptic reference to a sister device hidden somewhere deeper in the mountains. His grandfather had apparently built multiple prototypes, each one more advanced than the last. The current device was just the beginning. "There's something else," Sarah said, pointing to a postscript written in different ink. This part was added later. Jake read aloud. "The government will come looking eventually. When they do, remember that this technology belongs to humanity, not to any nation or corporation. Trust your heart, trust each other, and trust the mountain itself. It has been protecting our family's secrets for generations." A chill ran down Jake's spine as he realized the letter was dated just days before his grandfather's supposed accident. This wasn't just a contingency plan, it was a farewell message, written by a man who knew his time was running out. The workshop door creaked open, and Margaret stepped inside, her weathered face etched with concern. "I saw the smoke from your chimney stop. Everything all right up here?" Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. Margaret had lived in these mountains her entire life. If anyone might know about the secrets hidden here, it would be her. "Margaret," Jake began carefully, "did you know my grandfather well? Before he died, I mean." The old woman's eyes sharpened, and Jake caught a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or wariness. "Thomas Hartley was a good man," she said slowly. "Kept to himself mostly, but he helped folks when they needed it. Had a way of fixing things that seemed beyond repair." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying their faces. Finally she sighed. "Broken hearts, mostly. Families torn apart by pride or grief. Your grandfather had a gift for bringing people together, helping them remember what really mattered." She stepped closer to the device, running her gnarled fingers along its smooth surface. "This here machine," she said softly, "it's not the first one he built, is it?" Jake's heart raced. "You knew?" "Suspected," Margaret corrected. "My late husband suffered from what they'd probably call dementia now. Couldn't remember his own name half the time. But after spending an evening talking with your grandfather, he'd come home clear as daylight, telling me stories from our courtship like it happened yesterday. Lasted for weeks each time." She turned to face them directly, her expression serious. "There are folks coming up the mountain road, black cars with government plates. Figured you should know." The letter slipped from Jake's fingers as the weight of their situation hit him. Everything was about to change. The town hall buzzed with an energy Sarah had never witnessed before. Every seat was filled, people lined the walls, and late arrivals crowded near the doorway. She recognized faces from the diner, the hardware store, families she'd met during their months of building, but tonight they looked different, expectant, almost electric with possibility. Jake squeezed her hand as they made their way to the front. The device sat on a simple wooden table, its crystalline surface catching the fluorescent lights and throwing rainbows across the worn linoleum floor. After weeks of testing in private, they'd finally agreed it was time to show the community what they'd built from his grandfather's blueprints. "Nervous?" Jake whispered. Sarah nodded, terrified. Mayor Henderson called for quiet, but it took several minutes for the conversations to die down. "Most of you know why we're here," he began, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Jake and Sarah Morrison have something to show us, something that might change how we think about energy, about our future here in Pine Ridge." Dr. Elena Vasquez stepped forward from the crowd. Sarah's heart skipped. They hadn't expected the physicist to make the drive from the university. "I've had the privilege of examining their work preliminarily," Dr. Vasquez said. "What you're about to see defies conventional understanding of energy conversion." Jake stood, clearing his throat. "My grandfather left blueprints. We thought we were just restoring his cabin, but we found something more. Sarah and we built this together, and honestly, we're still learning what it can do." He activated the device. The familiar harmonic resonance filled the room, and the crystal began its mesmerizing dance of light. But tonight felt different. The audience's collective intake of breath seemed to amplify the effect. The lights overhead flickered, then steadied, glowing brighter than before. "It's drawing ambient electromagnetic energy from the environment and converting it," Sarah explained, her voice gaining confidence. "The technology is unlike anything in current scientific literature, but the results are measurable, repeatable, and scalable." Old Henrik from the lumber mill stood up. "What's it mean for us? For Pine Ridge?" Sarah exchanged glances with Jake. This was the question they'd debated for weeks. "It means energy independence," she said. "No more power outages during winter storms, lower costs for everyone. But more than that, it means Pine Ridge could become a model for sustainable mountain communities." Martha from the diner raised her hand. "Sounds too good to be true. What's the catch?" "The catch," Jake said slowly, "is that we don't fully understand the long-term implications. My grandfather's notes suggest he knew more than he wrote down. There are gaps, warnings about something he called the deeper resonance." Dr. Vasquez stepped closer to the device. "I've been studying the energy signatures. There are patterns that suggest this technology might be part of something larger. The mathematical models indicate your grandfather may have been working on a distributed network, multiple devices working in harmony." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They'd suspected the device was just the beginning, but hearing it confirmed by someone of Dr. Vasquez's caliber made it real. "There's something else," Jake said, his voice carrying a weight Sarah recognized. He'd been wrestling with this decision all day. "We found another room in the cabin's foundation yesterday. More blueprints, more detailed notes. My grandfather wasn't just an engineer. He was part of a research group working on revolutionary energy technology in the 1960s. Sarah watched the faces in the crowd shift from wonder to confusion to concern. Jake continued. "The group disbanded suddenly. The official records we've found suggest their research was deemed too dangerous. But my grandfather kept working, in secret, up here in the mountains." "Dangerous how?" Mayor Henderson asked. "We're not sure yet," Sarah admitted. "But there are references to unexpected resonance cascades, to the technology becoming self-sustaining beyond their ability to control it. My grandfather's final notes suggest he found a way to build in safeguards, but..." The device suddenly pulsed brighter, and for a moment, every electronic device in the room, phones, hearing aids, the PA system, hummed in harmony. The effect lasted only seconds, but the silence that followed was profound. Dr. Vasquez was frantically taking notes. "Did you initiate that?" "No," Jake said quietly. "It's been doing that more frequently, like it's learning." Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the room. They'd come here to share a breakthrough, to offer their community a gift, but now, standing before their neighbors with a technology they couldn't fully explain or control, she wondered if they'd opened a door they weren't prepared to walk through. The device settled back to its normal luminescence, but the questions in the room had only multiplied. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had just shifted, not just in the device, but in the very fabric of their mountain home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin's porch as Jake stood with trembling hands, holding the letter his grandfather had hidden beneath the floorboards. Sarah watched from the doorway, her face etched with concern as she witnessed the color drain from his features. "Jake," she whispered, stepping closer, "what does it say?" He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My grandfather didn't just design the energy system. He was part of something much bigger, a group of scientists who broke away from a government project in the 1960s. They called themselves the Prometheus Circle." Sarah's breath caught. "The same name from the blueprints?" They were working on clean energy solutions decades before anyone thought it was possible. But when they tried to share their discoveries with the world, they were silenced. My grandfather and the others scattered, hiding their research. Jake's voice cracked slightly. He came here not just to disappear, but to protect what they'd learned. The weight of the revelation settled between them like morning mist. Sarah reached for the letter, scanning the faded ink that revealed a story of brilliant minds forced into exile, of revolutionary discoveries buried beneath bureaucratic fear and corporate greed. "There are others," she said, pointing to a section near the bottom. "He mentions coordinates, locations where the other members went into hiding." Jake nodded slowly. 5 other locations, 5 other pieces of the puzzle. He paused, looking out at their thriving community where solar collectors gleamed and gardens flourished. "Sarah, what we've built here, it's just the beginning of what they envisioned." A knock at the cabin door interrupted their conversation. Mayor Thompson stood on the threshold, his usual stern demeanor replaced by something closer to wonder. "Sorry to disturb you," he began, "but we've got a situation in town. News crews are setting up on Main Street. Word about our energy independence has spread further than we thought." Through the window, they could see unfamiliar vehicles winding up the mountain road. Sarah felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had when their tech company first gained unwanted attention from competitors. "How many?" Jake asked. 3 major networks so far, plus some documentary crew from California. They're calling it the Mountain Miracle. Thompson's weathered face creased with worry. "People are asking questions we might not be ready to answer." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. They'd always known this moment would come, but discovering the truth about his grandfather's past had complicated everything exponentially. "We need to talk to Elena and Marcus," Sarah said, "and Mrs. Chen. If we're going to face this attention, the whole community needs to be prepared." An hour later, they'd gathered the core group in the community center that had once been Thompson's general store. The atmosphere was tense as Jake shared what they'd learned about the Prometheus Circle, watching faces cycle through disbelief, amazement, and concern. "So we're sitting on technology that powerful people tried to bury?" Marcus asked, his engineering mind already working through the implications. "It appears so," Jake confirmed. "And now that we've proven it works, they'll want to control it," Elena finished grimly. "Just like they did 50 years ago." Mrs. Chen, who had been silent throughout the explanation, finally spoke. "My late husband used to tell stories about government men coming through these mountains in the 60s, asked a lot of questions about the hermit in the woods." She looked directly at Jake. "Your grandfather helped save my family's farm during that drought in 72. Never asked for anything in return." "What do we do?" asked Thompson. "We can't hide forever, and those reporters aren't going to leave empty-handed." Sarah stood, her business instincts taking over. We control the narrative. We tell our story before someone else tells it for us, but we do it carefully, strategically. And the other locations? Jake asked quietly. The rest of the Prometheus Circle's research? One step at a time, Sarah replied, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. The coordinates in the letter could lead to discoveries that would revolutionize energy production worldwide, but they could also lead to the same fate that had befallen the original researchers. As if summoned by their conversation, a black SUV with government plates pulled into the community center's parking lot. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements precise and purposeful. "Looks like we're out of time," Thompson muttered. Jake felt the letter in his pocket, its weight seeming to increase with each passing second. His grandfather had spent decades protecting these secrets, living in isolation to keep them safe. Now Jake faced the same choice: reveal the truth and risk losing everything they'd built, or continue the cycle of silence and secrecy. The men approached the building with measured steps, and Jake realized that the next few minutes would determine not just their community's future, but possibly the fate of his grandfather's life's work. "Whatever happens," he said to the group, "we face it together." The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain as Jake stood before the assembled crowd, his hands trembling slightly as he held the final piece of his grandfather's journal. Sarah squeezed his shoulder, her touch grounding him as dozens of faces looked up expectantly from the clearing where their creation hummed with quiet energy. "There's something you all need to know," Jake began, his voice carrying across the crisp air. "About why my grandfather really came to this mountain and what we've actually built here." The device behind him pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the forest itself. Over the past weeks, it had transformed their small community in ways none of them had initially understood. Crops grew with unprecedented vigor, the elderly found their ailments mysteriously improving, and even the wildlife had begun to change, becoming more vibrant, more alive. Jake opened the leather-bound journal to pages he'd discovered only the night before, hidden behind a false backing that Sarah's careful fingers had found. "My grandfather wasn't just an inventor. He was part of a government project in the 1940s, something called the Vitality Initiative." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tom Hendricks stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "What kind of project, son?" "They were trying to harness what they called life energy," Jake continued, reading from the faded handwriting. "The war had shown them the incredible capacity for destruction that science could unleash. A small group of scientists wanted to explore the opposite, technology that could enhance and preserve life instead of ending it." Sarah took the journal from his hands, her voice steady as she read aloud. "March 15th, 1947. The resonance experiments show promise beyond our wildest hopes. We've discovered frequencies that appear to stimulate cellular regeneration and enhance the natural energy patterns of living organisms. But the military applications terrify me. They want to weaponize even this, create super soldiers, extend life indefinitely for a select few." The weight of those words settled over the gathering like snow. Jake watched as understanding dawned on face after face. Mrs. Chen, whose arthritis had virtually disappeared since the device activated, pressed her hand to her chest. The Morrison children, who'd been recovering from a flu that had lingered for months, stood closer to their parents. "That's why he left," Jake realized aloud, the pieces finally clicking into place. He couldn't let them turn his life's work into another weapon. So he took the research, the blueprints, everything, and disappeared into these mountains. "But why hide it here?" asked Elena Santos, the young mother whose infant son had thrived remarkably since their arrival. "Why not destroy it?" Sarah found the answer in the journal's final entries. "Because he believed that someday, when the world was ready, when people could approach this technology with wisdom instead of fear or greed, it could be used as intended, to heal, to restore, to help life flourish." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. People who'd started as strangers but had become something like family over these extraordinary weeks. The farmers whose lands had become impossibly fertile, the retired teacher whose memory had sharpened dramatically, the local doctor who'd watched in amazement as chronic conditions simply improved. The question now, Jake said, is what we do with this knowledge. Tom Hendricks was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the authority of someone who'd lived through enough history to understand its patterns. The government still exists, Jake. The same impulses that drove your grandfather away, they're still out there, stronger than ever maybe. Which is why it can't leave this mountain, Sarah said firmly. Not yet, maybe not ever. A heated discussion erupted. Some argued for sharing the technology with the world, imagining the diseases that could be cured, the suffering that could be alleviated. Others worried about the consequences of such power in the wrong hands, the potential for exploitation, for creating new forms of inequality. As the voices rose around him, Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather, a man he'd barely known but whose courage had shaped this moment across decades. The old man had faced an impossible choice and chosen preservation over progress, hope over immediate action. "We continue as we are," Jake finally announced, his voice cutting through the debate. "This stays our secret, our responsibility. We protect it, we learn from it, and maybe we figure out how to share its benefits without sharing its dangers." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what they were accepting. They would become guardians of something extraordinary, keepers of a technology that could change the world but might destroy it in the wrong hands. As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying the burden of this incredible secret, Jake felt the presence of his grandfather's spirit in the mountain wind. Some legacies, he realized, weren't meant to be rushed into the light. Some gifts required patience, wisdom, and the courage to wait for the right moment to share them with the world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the workshop as Jake stood before the completed invention. His grandfather's blueprints spread across the worn wooden table. After weeks of painstaking construction, the device hummed with quiet energy, a revolutionary water purification and irrigation system that could transform the entire mountain region's struggling agricultural economy. Sarah emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her hair catching the golden light. "The town council meeting is in 2 hours," she said, handing him a cup. "Are you ready for this?" Jake nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Grandfather's notes mentioned something about a final revelation, but I can't find any reference to what that means." He gestured to a section of the blueprints where faded ink had created gaps in the text. "There's definitely something missing here." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley. 3 black SUVs wound up the mountain road, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sky like dark mirrors. Jake and Sarah exchanged worried glances. "Expecting company?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "No." Jake's jaw clenched as the vehicles pulled into the clearing. "But I have a feeling I know who this is." The doors opened simultaneously, and men in expensive suits emerged, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The lead figure, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Jacob Morrison!" the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and closed-door meetings. "I'm Thomas Blackwood from Meridian Industries. We need to talk." Jake stepped protectively in front of the workshop. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think you'll find this conversation worth your time. You see, your grandfather and my father had a rather complicated business relationship, one that was never properly resolved." Sarah moved closer to Jake, her hand finding his arm. "What kind of relationship?" "The kind that involves stolen intellectual property," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Your grandfather, Walter Morrison, was brilliant, but he was also a thief. The technology you've been building belongs to Meridian Industries." Jake's coffee mug hit the ground, ceramic shattering against stone. "That's impossible." These are his original designs, his handwriting, copied from my father's private research laboratory in 1962, Blackwood interrupted. Walter was a junior engineer on the project. When funding was cut, he disappeared with the only complete set of blueprints. He gestured toward the workshop. We've been tracking those plans for 60 years. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake felt the foundation of everything he believed about his grandfather shifting beneath his feet. Even if that were true, which I don't believe, the statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing intellectual property theft, Blackwood finished. Every component you've built, every innovation you've added, it's all fruit from a poisoned tree. Sarah stepped forward, her business instincts sharpening. What do you want? Simple. Turn over all materials related to the project, blueprints, prototypes, research notes, and we'll consider the matter closed. Continue down this path, and you'll find yourself in legal proceedings that will make your head spin. Jake's mind raced through memories of his grandfather, the quiet man who had taught him to build things with his hands, who had spoken of making the world better through innovation and kindness. The idea that Walter had been a thief felt like a betrayal of everything Jake held sacred. But then he remembered something. Racing into the cabin, he returned with a wooden box he'd found weeks earlier but hadn't fully examined. Inside, beneath yellowed photographs and letters, lay a leather journal bound with string. My grandfather kept detailed records, Jake said, untying the journal. As he opened it, loose papers fluttered out. Official documents, letters, and what appeared to be legal contracts. This is a partnership agreement between Walter Morrison and... Jake's voice trailed off as he read the signature. Richard Blackwood, dated 1961. Thomas Blackwood's composed expression cracked slightly. Let me see that. It clearly states that both men contributed equally to the research, Sarah read over Jake's shoulder, and that Walter retained rights to continue development if the project was abandoned. She looked up at Blackwood, which it was, when your father's company pulled funding. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Blackwood's men shifted uncomfortably behind him, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Furthermore, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger as he read, there's a clause here about shared profits from any future development. Seems like your family owes mine 60 years of royalties. Blackwood's face darkened. This isn't over, Morrison. We have resources you can't imagine. And we have the truth, Sarah replied evenly, along with a community that's about to benefit from technology that was legally developed by Jake's grandfather. As the black SUVs disappeared down the mountain road, Jake felt the weight of revelation settling around him. His grandfather hadn't been a thief. He'd been a man fighting to protect his life's work from those who would suppress it. The real question now was whether they could complete Walter's vision before Blackwood returned with heavier artillery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed valley as Jake stood on the cabin's newly expanded porch, watching the last of the installation crews pack their equipment. What had begun as a simple restoration project had become something neither he nor Sarah could have imagined when they first discovered those hidden blueprints tucked behind loose floorboards. Sarah emerged from inside, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of completion. The final calibrations are done, she announced, settling beside him on the wooden railing their grandfather had carved decades ago. The community energy grid is fully operational. Below them, the mountain town hummed with quiet efficiency. Solar collectors disguised as natural rock formations dotted the landscape, while underground geothermal systems, designed according to his grandfather's remarkably prescient blueprints, provided clean power to every home and business. The old man's vision of sustainable technology seamlessly integrated with nature had finally come to life. Hard to believe it's been 6 months, Jake murmured, wrapping his arm around Sarah's shoulders. The physical closeness still sent sparks through him, their relationship having deepened through countless late nights troubleshooting circuits and arguing over optimal placement strategies. Mrs. Chen appeared on the path below, waving enthusiastically as she headed toward the community center. Her arthritis had improved dramatically since the installation of the therapeutic frequency generators, another innovation hidden within his grandfather's detailed schematics. The entire town seemed revitalized, not just by the clean energy, but by the sense of purpose that had emerged during the collaborative building process. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, producing a weathered envelope from her jacket pocket. "I found this yesterday, tucked inside the final blueprint tube. It has your name on it." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the letter, recognizing his grandfather's careful handwriting immediately. "My dear Jake, if you're reading this, then you've successfully built what I could only dream of creating in my lifetime. The technology was too advanced for my era, but I knew that someday someone with your brilliance and determination would discover these plans and bring them to fruition. What you've accomplished is more than an engineering marvel. It's a bridge between generations, a testament to the power of vision combined with action. The woman beside you, I suspect, has been instrumental in this achievement. Your grandmother and I had that same partnership, that same fire. But there's one final secret I must share. The land deed you'll find in the oak chest isn't just for the cabin. Your great-great-grandfather acquired mineral rights to the entire mountain range, rights that were forgotten as generations passed. With your community energy project now proven successful, you have the legal standing to expand this model across the entire region. The choice is yours, but remember, true legacy isn't measured in profits or patents. It's measured in the lives touched, the communities strengthened, and the world left better than you found it. Build wisely, love deeply, and never stop dreaming of impossible things. Your grandfather, Thomas. Sarah leaned against him as he finished reading, her presence grounding him as the magnitude of the revelation settled in. The mineral rights alone were worth hundreds of millions, but more importantly, they represented the opportunity to replicate their sustainable energy model across hundreds of communities. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Jake folded the letter carefully, looking out over the thriving town below. Children played in the newly constructed park. Their laughter carried on clean mountain air. The local diner displayed a hiring sign, business booming as environmental researchers and sustainable technology enthusiasts flocked to witness their achievement firsthand. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that my grandfather was right about partnerships." He turned to face Sarah fully, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "About finding someone who shares your vision and won't let you settle for anything less than extraordinary." Sarah's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a ring he'd crafted himself from rare minerals found during their excavation work, set with a stone that seemed to capture and reflect the morning light in impossible ways. "Sarah Chen," he continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "will you help me build the impossible for the rest of our lives?" Her answer came not in words, but in the fierce kiss that followed, sealing a promise that extended far beyond marriage into a shared commitment to continue his grandfather's work on a scale that would reshape how communities everywhere thought about energy, sustainability, and the delicate balance between progress and preservation. As they broke apart, both laughing and crying simultaneously, Jake knew that this was just the beginning. The cabin would always be their sanctuary, the place where it all started, but their real work lay ahead, transforming not just this mountain community, but pioneering a model that could heal the relationship between human innovation and the natural world. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility and grounded in the wisdom of generations past.